Charles Laurent moved with the precision of a machine through the grand corridors of the ancient Laurent estate. Everything in his life was meticulously arranged. A tightly packed schedule, a billion-euro business empire running smoothly, and his household operating like a Swiss clock. At 42, Charles left no room for surprises. He had built a life devoid of chaos. But that morning, as he passed by the large window overlooking the garden, a scene made him stop in his tracks. His son, Oliver, age 12, was dancing on the lawn. The boy was not alone. Beside him was Emma, the family's cook, hired 6 months ago. Charles had scarcely noticed her. A quiet woman, efficient and unobtrusive. But now he couldn't take his eyes off them. They danced together, their movements synchronized yet imperfect. Oliver was clumsy, his steps hesitant, but his face bore a smile. A carefree smile Charles hadn't seen since his wife's passing 3 years ago. Emma, in contrast, moved with astonishing grace, each step precise and fluid, as if she had been trained for it. This was no spontaneous game. She was teaching him. A chill ran down Charles's spine. He didn't like this feeling, the sense of losing control. A mere employee, a cook, having such influence over his son? That was unacceptable. With a stiff gait, he strode outside, his shoes clicking sharply against the stone path. As he approached, Oliver stopped dancing, the smile fading from his face, replaced by a look of apprehension. Emma, however, remained composed. She wiped her hands on her apron, stood tall, and met Charles's gaze without flinching. "What's going on here?" Charles's voice was cold, controlled. Oliver lowered his head, but Emma responded evenly, "We're practicing, sir." "Practicing what, exactly?" Charles asked, his eyes narrowing. "He wants to learn to dance," she replied without hesitation. Charles turned to Oliver. "Since when?" The boy faltered, shuffling his feet. "For a while now, sir," he said softly. A pang of guilt pierced Charles's chest. He had never noticed. He had never asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Oliver shrugged, but before he could answer, Emma spoke up. "Because he had no one to practice with." Charles turned to her, his gaze icy. There was something in her tone, a firmness, almost a challenge, that irritated him. "This isn't your job," he stated. "You're right," Emma agreed, unwavering. "But he asked me to help." Charles looked back at Oliver. "Is that true?" The boy nodded, his eyes averted. Silence hung heavily. Charles exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the rising irritation. He didn't understand why he was so bothered. Everything in his life was under control, but this scene, his son laughing, dancing with a stranger, made him uneasy. Something was off, a layer of secrecy he couldn't yet see. "I need to speak with you alone," Charles said to Emma, his voice firm. Oliver glanced between them, his brow furrowing with worry. Emma, still calm, nodded. "As you wish." Charles turned sharply, walking back into the house without waiting for her. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Oliver whispering something to Emma. She replied softly, her voice too low for him to hear. Oliver smiled, a mischievous smile, as if they shared a secret. A chill ran through Charles. Something was happening, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Charles Laurent sat in his expansive office, the light from the crystal chandelier casting a glow on the intricately carved walnut bookshelves. Before him, the computer screen displayed the profile of Emma Vogel, the cook he had hired 6 months ago through a reputable agency. Her record was almost impeccably clean. 29 years old, no criminal history, with experience working in small restaurants in Vienna before joining the Laurent estate. Nothing stood out as unusual. But Charles, with the instincts that had built his business empire, knew that perfection often concealed secrets. He typed her name into the search bar, adding the keyword dancer, an inexplicable intuition sparked by the way she had moved in the garden that morning, graceful as if the stage were her home. At first, the results were unremarkable, a few unrelated articles and vague social media profiles. But then, buried on the 3rd page of search results, he found an article from 7 years ago. Its headline made his pulse quicken. Young ballet star Emma Vogel vanishes from the spotlight. Charles clicked the article. A photograph appeared, a younger Emma dressed in a pristine white ballet costume standing on a grand stage with her arms raised in perfect form. The article praised her as a rare talent, a ballerina predicted to conquer international stages. She had performed at the l'Opéra Garnier in Paris and received invitations from prestigious ballet companies. Then, abruptly, she disappeared. No interviews, no explanations, no scandals. Just gone. Charles leaned back in his chair, his breath heavy. Why would someone like her abandon everything to become a cook in his household? What had driven her from the limelight? And, more pressingly, why had she chosen to teach Oliver to dance when she had clearly tried to bury her past? He stood abruptly, striding out of the office, determined to confront Emma. In the kitchen, she was chopping vegetables with the precision of someone accustomed to discipline. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but guarded. "Mr. Laurent," she greeted, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Is there something you need?" Charles didn't waste time. He placed his phone on the counter, the article about her displayed on the screen. "Explain this." For the first time, Charles saw a flicker of surprise cross Emma's face. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to confirm he had touched a secret. She glanced at the screen, then back at him, her voice steady but cautious. "You've been looking into me." "I don't tolerate mysteries in my home," Charles replied, crossing his arms. "Who are you, Emma Vogel? And why are you here?" Emma sighed, setting the towel down. She was silent for a long moment, as if weighing whether to tell the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I was a dancer. A long time ago." "Not just a dancer," Charles interrupted. "You were a star. And you walked away from it all. Why?" Emma looked down at her hands, once graceful on stage, now calloused from kitchen work. "Because I had no other choice," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You want the truth? When I was 22, I lost everything." Charles frowned, waiting. She continued, her gaze distant as if peering into a painful memory. "I had a partner, another dancer. We trained together since we were children, dreaming of conquering the world. We were invited to an international tour, the pinnacle of our careers. But the day before our biggest performance, he died. A car accident." Silence enveloped the kitchen. Charles felt the weight of her words, the pain still raw despite the years. "After that," Emma went on, "I couldn't dance. Every note, every step felt like it was tearing me apart. I left, searching for a new life, a place without stages or spotlights." "And you chose to be a cook?" Charles asked, his tone softer now. Emma gave a faint, humorless smile. "I needed something simple, practical. Something that wouldn't remind me of the past." Charles nodded slowly, but one question still gnawed at him. "Then why teach Oliver? If you wanted to forget, why return to dance?" Emma met his gaze, her eyes unguarded for the first time. "Because he reminds me of myself. A lost child, searching for joy. I couldn't say no when he asked me." Her words hit Charles hard. He knew Oliver had changed since his mother's death, retreating into books and rigid routines. Charles had thought providing stability was enough, but now he realized he'd overlooked the most important thing, his son's smile. "You're overstepping, Emma," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "He doesn't smile, Mr. Laurent," Emma replied, her tone firm. "Not because he doesn't want to, but because no one has given him the chance." Charles stiffened, unsure how to respond. Her words weren't an accusation, but they made him feel exposed. He had been so consumed with controlling everything, his business, his home, Oliver's life, that he'd forgotten his son needed more than that. "I'll be watching you," Charles said, his voice low but no longer cold. "Don't think I'll trust you easily just because of the story." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "I don't expect you to, but I hope you'll pay more attention to Oliver." Charles turned away without replying. As he left the kitchen, a new unease stirred within him. Emma Vogel was more than a cook, and her presence in this house was disrupting everything he thought was certain. But for the first time, he wondered if that disruption was exactly what Oliver needed. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the grand drawing room in the Laurent estate. Charles stood by the door, arms tightly crossed, watching Oliver and Emma in the garden. They were practicing again, but this time, there was no hesitation in Oliver's steps. The boy moved with remarkable focus, though still clumsy. Emma, standing beside him, corrected his posture, her voice gentle but firm. "Keep your back straight, Oliver. Don't let your shoulders drop." Charles couldn't deny the change in his son. Oliver, once lost in books and repetitive routines, now had a spark in his eyes. A fire Charles hadn't seen since his wife's passing. But that fire had been kindled by Emma, a woman Charles still didn't fully trust. Though her story about her past explained much, He sensed there was something she hadn't revealed. Within him, a silent battle raged. Part of him wanted to thank Emma for bringing back Oliver's smile. But the larger part, the part accustomed to controlling everything, bristled at the influence an outsider, a mere employee, held over his son. Charles knew he had to do something, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what his next step should be. That evening, in the expansive dining room, the chandelier's light bathed the long oak table in a warm glow. Oliver sat across from Charles, his eyes fixed on his plate, his foot tapping lightly beneath the table. Charles noticed his son's tension, something he had rarely paid attention to before. He set down his cutlery, his voice softer than usual. "You have something to tell me, don't you?" Oliver hesitated, gripping his fork tightly. Then, taking a deep breath as if summoning all his courage, he spoke. "I want to compete in a dance tournament, Father." Charles froze, not out of surprise. He had seen this coming since watching Oliver practice, but because of the determination in the boy's voice. "A tournament?" he repeated, his tone calm but sharp. "Do you realize it's not a game? It's pressure, discipline, and the possibility of failure." Oliver nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know, Father, but I want to try. Emma says I can do it, and I think so too." A wave of unease surged within Charles at the mention of Emma's name. "She says you're ready?" he asked, his voice lower, almost challenging. "Yes," Oliver replied, sitting up straighter. "She says I have passion, and if I work hard, I can do it." Charles looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw something new. Oliver was no longer the timid boy who avoided his gaze. The child before him now had a resolve, a will Charles hadn't anticipated. But it didn't ease the worry in his heart. A tournament wasn't just about joy. It would bring pressure, competition, and the risk of failure. Having lost his wife to an unexpected tragedy, Charles wasn't sure he could bear watching Oliver face defeat, or worse, lose the spark he had just found. "Are you certain?" Charles asked, his voice carrying a rare softness. "If you do this, you have to do it properly. No half measures." Oliver's face lit up, his smile radiant like sunlight after a storm. "I promise, Father. I'll give it my all." Charles nodded, but a question lingered in his mind. Was he ready to let Oliver step into this world? After dinner, Charles found Emma in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her movements swift yet methodical. When he entered, she paused, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at him, her eyes seeming to anticipate his purpose. "You knew he'd ask me about the tournament," Charles said, crossing his arms. Emma tilted her head, her expression unchanged. "I thought he might. Oliver has determination, sir. He wants to prove himself." Charles frowned. "Prove himself to whom? To you? Or to himself?" Emma gave a faint smile, but her eyes were sharp. "Perhaps to you." Her words cut like a blade, not because they were aggressive, but because they were true. Charles knew he hadn't spent enough time with Oliver, hadn't truly listened to him. But he didn't want to admit that, especially to Emma. "If he does this," Charles said, his voice firm, "you need to train him seriously. No soft encouragements. He needs to be pushed to his limits." Emma nodded, unshaken. "I never planned to go easy on him. But you need to understand, Mr. Laurent, that Oliver doesn't just need discipline. He needs to be believed in." Charles fell silent, unsure how to respond. Emma Vogel, with all her calm and mystery, was challenging the way he viewed his role as a father. And that made him both irritated and intrigued. The next morning, training officially began. Charles stood at the door of the drawing room, which Emma had transformed into a temporary practice space. Oliver stood in the center, sweat beading on his forehead as Emma guided him through a sequence of steps. "Right foot, Oliver. Light but firm," she said, her voice strict but not harsh. Oliver stumbled once, then again, but instead of giving up, he gritted his teeth and tried again. Charles noticed another change in his son. Persistence. Before, Oliver would have quit when faced with difficulty. But now he pressed on, even as his legs trembled with fatigue. Emma, in her role as coach, was entirely different from the quiet cook Charles had known. She moved with the precision of a master, correcting Oliver's every movement with meticulous attention to detail. Focus on the rhythm, Oliver. Rhythm is the heart of the dance. When the session ended, Oliver collapsed onto the floor, panting heavily. Emma handed him a water bottle, offering a slight smile. Well done. You did good today. Oliver grinned, a radiant smile, and Charles felt his heart tighten. He couldn't recall the last time he'd seen his son this happy. But as he looked at Emma, he still sensed a distance. A wall she had built, hiding something deeper. She wasn't just teaching Oliver to dance. She was giving him something Charles hadn't. Faith in himself. Charles turned away, his mind in turmoil. He had spent his life controlling everything, but now he realized there were things he couldn't control, and perhaps he shouldn't try. The following weeks passed in a new rhythm at the Laurent estate. Each morning, the grand drawing room, once reserved for lavish parties, transformed into Oliver's practice space. Emma stood at the center, guiding the boys' every movement with the precision of someone who had lived for art. Charles, despite his busy schedule of meetings and contracts, found himself frequently stopping by, standing quietly at the door, observing. He wouldn't admit it, but each time he saw Oliver smile after nailing a step, his heart felt a little lighter. Today, the training session was more intense. Oliver, drenched in sweat, was working to perfect a sequence of spins and leaps that Emma called the crescendo of the dance. He stumbled, crashing hard onto the wooden floor, but instead of stopping, he got up immediately, his eyes blazing with determination. Again, he said, his voice resolute. Emma nodded, showing no leniency. Good, but this time, keep your center of gravity lower. You're losing balance in the spin. From the corner of the room, Charles noticed the stark change in his son. Oliver was no longer the timid boy who sought approval. He was becoming someone with resolve, ready to face challenges. But Charles also saw something else. Oliver's growing reliance on Emma. It made him both grateful and uneasy. That evening, at the dining table, Oliver barely touched the beef stew Emma had prepared. He sat quietly, his foot tapping lightly beneath the table, his gaze distant. Charles recognized his son's tension, a feeling he knew well from his own days facing business pressures. "What's on your mind, Oliver?" he asked, setting down his wine glass. Oliver hesitated, then pulled out his phone and slid it toward Charles. The screen displayed a message from an unfamiliar name. Victor Moreau. The words were brief but cutting. "Heard you're entering the tournament. Don't waste your time. I've won 2 years in a row. You don't stand a chance." Charles frowned, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Who's Victor Moreau?" "The strongest competitor in the tournament," Oliver said, his voice soft but steady. "He's really good. I watched his videos. It's like he never makes mistakes." Charles looked at his son, striving to keep his tone calm. "And what do you think about this message?" Oliver bit his lip, his eyes wavering. "I don't know. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not good enough." Charles leaned forward, his gaze sharp but not harsh. "Listen to me, Oliver. People only try to tear you down when they feel threatened. If this Victor took the time to message you, it means he's already worried." Oliver looked up, his eyes brightening slightly. "You really think so?" "Of course," Charles replied, his voice firm. "Let your performance answer him." A radiant smile returned to Oliver's face, though small. "I'll try, Father. I want to prove him wrong." Charles nodded, but inside, a storm of emotions churned. He was proud of Oliver's resolve, but also afraid. This tournament wasn't just a chance for his son to shine. It was a door to failures Charles wasn't sure he could witness. After dinner, Charles found Emma in the garden behind the house, sitting on a stone bench, gazing at the night sky. The moonlight illuminated her face, highlighting delicate features Charles hadn't noticed before. He paused, crossing his arms. "Victor Moreau," he said without preamble. "You know him?" Emma turned, her expression unsurprised. "I've heard of him. A talented dancer, but arrogant. He's dominated youth tournaments for 2 years." Charles frowned. "And you think Oliver can beat him?" Emma tilted her head, considering her answer. "I think Oliver has something Victor doesn't. heart. But he'll need more than that. Victor isn't just skilled. He knows how to pressure his opponents. Charles nodded slowly, absorbing her words. What will you do to prepare him? I'll push him to his limits, Emma said, her voice steady. But you have a role to play too, Mr. Laurent. Charles narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Emma stood, meeting his gaze directly. Oliver doesn't just need a coach. He needs a father who believes in him. If you keep worrying about him failing, he'll sense it. And that will make him doubt himself. Her words hit like a blow. Charles wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He had spent his life shielding Oliver from harm, but perhaps that very protection had held his son back from growing. I'll consider it, Charles said, his voice low but no longer cold. But if Oliver fails, you'll answer for it. Emma gave a faint smile, her eyes unwavering. If Oliver fails, sir, it will be because he dared to try. And that's worth more than any victory. Charles didn't respond. He turned, stepping into the garden's darkness, his mind heavy. Emma Vogel wasn't just teaching his son to dance. She was teaching him how to be a father. And for the first time, Charles wondered if he had the courage to learn that lesson. The tournament drew closer each day, and the atmosphere in the Laurent estate grew tense. The drawing room, now Oliver's official practice space, resonated with the soft strains of classical music, interwoven with the sound of footsteps and Emma's stern instructions. Slow down, Oliver. Feel the rhythm before you move, she said, standing in the center of the room, her sharp eyes tracking the boy's every motion. Oliver, sweat streaming down his forehead, nodded, his focus intense. He was no longer the clumsy boy from weeks ago. Each step, each spin carried a newfound confidence, though not yet perfected. Charles stood at the door, as was his habit, watching from afar. He had grown accustomed to this sight, his son sweating, striving, sometimes failing, but always getting back up. Emma, with the patience and rigor of a true coach, had transformed Oliver into a version Charles scarcely recognized, a boy unafraid of challenges. But this transformation also unsettled Charles. He had spent his life shielding Oliver from pain, but this tournament, with its glaring stage lights and the scrutiny of hundreds of spectators, could inflict wounds he couldn't control. That evening, Charles sat in his office, the computer screen's glow illuminating his face. He had looked up more about Victor Moreau, the rival Oliver had mentioned. Online videos revealed Victor as a formidable dancer, each movement crisp, confident, nearly flawless. But what caught Charles's attention wasn't Victor's technique, it was his eyes, cold and arrogant, as if he already knew he'd win. A surge of anger rose within Charles. Victor wasn't just a competitor, he was a threat to the fragile confidence Oliver was building. He shut the computer, stood, and headed to the kitchen. Emma was there, preparing breakfast for the next day, her hands moving with familiar precision. She looked up as he entered, her gaze probing. Mr. Laurent, she greeted, her voice even. Is something the matter? I've seen Victor Moreau's videos, Charles said, cutting to the chase. He's very good. Do you really think Oliver can compete with him? Emma paused her chopping, set the knife down, and met his eyes. Victor has technique, but he dances to win. Oliver dances for love. That's the difference. Charles frowned. Passion alone won't win a tournament. True, Emma agreed, her voice calm. But passion can help him overcome failure. And that's what you should care about more, sir. Charles bristled at her candor but couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had seen Oliver change, growing stronger, yet the thought of his son facing defeat still gnawed at him. If he loses, he said, his voice low, will he be able to handle it? Emma tilted her head, her eyes softening. The question isn't whether Oliver can handle it. It's whether you can let him face it on his own. Her words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they laid bare Charles's deepest fear. He had lost his wife, and now the idea of Oliver being hurt, even by a tournament loss, made him feel powerless. He gave a stiff nod, turned away without another word, but inside he knew Emma was right. The day of the tournament finally arrived. The Grand Theater in central Vienna blazed with lights, the air thick with excitement and tension. Young dancers warmed up backstage, the tap of their shoes on the wooden floor mingling with the murmurs of coaches. Oliver stood among them, adjusting his shoelaces, his hands trembling slightly. Charles, a few meters away, sensed his son's nervousness but forced himself to maintain a composed exterior. Emma stood beside Oliver, placing a hand on his shoulder. Breathe, she said, her voice gentle yet firm. You've worked hard. Now just dance. Oliver nodded, his eyes seeking Charles. His father stepped forward, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice low. You can do this. Just be yourself. Oliver smiled, a small but determined smile. Thank you, Father. When the loudspeaker announced Oliver Laurent's name, the boy stepped onto the stage. Blinding lights shone down, and in that moment, Charles felt his heart clench. He couldn't control what was about to happen, and for the first time, he realized he might not need to. Oliver began to dance. His first movement was precise, smoother than Charles had ever seen. He moved with the music, his body flowing with the melody. There was a moment when he nearly stumbled, but he quickly regained balance, continuing with absolute focus. Charles watched his son, not with the anxious eyes of a worried father, but with pride. Oliver wasn't just dancing, he was telling a story, his own story. When the performance ended, the auditorium fell silent for a second, then erupted in thunderous applause. Oliver stood there, chest heaving, sweat glinting under the lights. Charles rose, clapping, and beside him, Emma did the same, her eyes shining with pride. The results were announced shortly after. And the champion of this year's tournament is Victor Moreau. The crowd roared again, but Oliver stood still, his expression unchanged. Charles felt a pang of pain, but before he could speak, the announcer continued, "We also present the Artistic Expression Award for the dancer who demonstrates not only technique but heart and passion. This award goes to Oliver Laurent." The auditorium exploded once more. Oliver, stunned, stepped forward to receive his medal, his eyes searching for his father in the crowd. Charles nodded, a rare smile breaking across his face. It wasn't the grandest victory, but to him it was everything. After the competition, in the dressing room, Victor Moreau approached Oliver, his golden trophy gleaming in his hand. "Not bad, Laurent," he said, his tone half teasing, half serious. "Maybe next year you'll be a real rival." Oliver smiled, undaunted. "Next year, I'll win." Victor smirked, but his eyes lacked their former arrogance. "We'll see." Outside the theater, Charles and Emma waited for Oliver. When the boy appeared, his medal gleaming on his chest, Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked. Oliver thought for a moment, then answered, "Proud. And I want to keep going." Charles nodded, feeling a relief he'd never known before. "Then we will." As they walked toward the car, Charles glanced at Emma. She offered a faint smile, but her eyes seemed to hold a question whether she would stay here or if her past would pull her elsewhere. Charles didn't ask, but he knew whatever happened, she had changed their family forever. Early morning sunlight slipped through the silk curtains of the Laurent estate's drawing room, once Oliver's practice space, now restored to its quiet elegance. The tournament had ended a week ago, but its echoes lingered. Oliver, his Artistic Expression Award medal dangling from a bookshelf in his room, was no longer the withdrawn boy he once was. He often hummed the tune of his dance, his feet unconsciously moving to the rhythm even while doing homework. Charles noticed this change more keenly than ever. He had thought the tournament would be a milestone, a pause in his son's sudden passion. But seeing Oliver secretly rewatching his performance video, his eyes alight with a hunger to continue, Charles knew this wasn't an end. It was a beginning. And that made him both proud and apprehensive. One afternoon, Charles sat in his office, reviewing financial reports, but his mind kept drifting to his conversation with Emma after the tournament. She had said little, only congratulating Oliver before quietly resuming her kitchen duties. But something in her eyes, a distance, as if she were preparing to leave, unsettled Charles. Emma Vogel, though he hated to admit it, had become integral to Oliver's transformation. And perhaps to his own. He stood and headed to the kitchen. Emma was there, kneading dough for bread, her hands moving with familiar precision. She looked up as Charles entered, her gaze probing but not surprised. "Mr. Laurent," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something the matter?" Charles crossed his arms, standing at the threshold. "Oliver wants to keep dancing," he said bluntly. "He told me this morning. He wants to compete in another tournament, a bigger one, next year." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "I expected as much. He has fire in him." That award didn't satisfy him, it only made him want more. Charles frowned, unsure if he admired her confidence or found it irksome. "And you? Will you continue coaching him?" The question hung in the air. Emma paused, her eyes flickering, the first crack Charles had seen in her composure. "You want me to stay?" she asked, her voice soft but layered with meaning. Charles didn't answer immediately. He wasn't used to admitting he needed anyone, especially someone who had once been just a household employee. But deep down he knew Oliver needed Emma. And perhaps he needed her to better understand his son. "He trusts you," he said finally, his voice low. "And I see the results." Emma gave a faint smile, but her eyes remained guarded. "I'll consider it, sir. But I'm not sure I can stay forever." A chill ran down Charles's spine. "Why not?" She turned back to the dough as if needing an excuse to avoid his gaze. I left my past behind for a reason. Teaching Oliver, it brings back things I've tried to forget. I'm not sure I'm ready to face them indefinitely. Her words left Charles silent. He wanted to press further to uncover the secret she still held, but he knew this wasn't the time. Instead, he nodded. Think about it. For Oliver. Emma didn't reply, but her slight nod told Charles she wouldn't decide hastily. That evening, Charles and Oliver sat across from each other in the dining room. Unlike previous meals, Oliver was brimming with energy, talking nonstop about new moves he wanted to try. Emma said, if I can perfect the double spin, I'll have a better shot at the next tournament, he said eagerly, his eyes sparkling. Charles smiled, a genuine smile, rare for him. You really love this, don't you? Oliver nodded, then hesitated as if about to say something significant. Father, thank you for letting me do the tournament. I know you were worried, but I feel like I've found something that's mine. Oliver's words struck Charles deeply. He looked at his son, seeing not just a boy but a young person forging his own path. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice hoarse. And I'll always be here, no matter what you choose. Oliver beamed, a radiant smile, and for the first time in years, Charles felt a true connection between them. The next morning, Charles stood at the drawing room door where Emma and Oliver had resumed training. But this time, another figure appeared, an elderly woman with silver hair and an elegant bearing, entering through the back door. Emma froze, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the woman. Madame Clara, she whispered, her voice trembling. Charles frowned, recognizing the name. Clara Hoffman, a legend in the ballet world, had been Emma Vogel's teacher, according to the article he'd read. She approached, offering Emma a warm smile. It's been a long time, Emma. I heard you're training a new student. Emma stiffened, her gaze darting between Clara and Oliver. How did you know I was here? Clara smiled gently, but her eyes were keen. Did you think someone like you could vanish completely from the ballet world? I've been keeping track of you, Emma. And I'm here because I believe it's time for you to face the stage again. The air grew heavy. Emma took a step back, her eyes filled with conflict. Oliver, bewildered, looked from Emma to Clara, unsure of what was happening. But Charles understood. This moment wasn't just about Oliver or the tournament. It was about Emma, the past she had fled, and whether she had the courage to move forward. Autumn draped the Laurent estate in a soft golden light, with dry leaves scattering across the stone pathway. In the drawing room, the strains of ballet music had become a familiar presence, but today there was no practice. Oliver sat in an armchair, engrossed in a book about the history of ballet that Emma had given him, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Charles stood at the door, watching his son, feeling a peace he had never known before. The encounter with Clara Hoffman the previous day still lingered. Emma, after facing her former teacher, had grown quieter. Charles noticed her avoiding eye contact, as if grappling with a momentous decision. He knew this moment, when Emma had to choose between staying or leaving, would shape not only her future but that of his family. That morning, Charles found Emma in the garden, where she often retreated to think. She sat on a stone bench, clutching an old silk scarf, her gaze distant. Charles paused, reluctant to disturb the silence, but finally spoke. Have you decided? Emma looked up, her eyes a mix of vulnerability and resolve. Clara wants me to return to the stage, she said, her voice low. She says a ballet company in Paris is looking for a coach. They know about me, about what I used to do. She thinks I could start again. Charles felt a pang in his chest, not from surprise, but because he had sensed this coming. And what do you think? He asked, striving to keep his voice steady. Emma twisted the scarf in her hands, her eyes sweeping over the garden. I fled that world because I couldn't bear the pain. But teaching Oliver, it reminded me how much I loved it. I'm not sure I can return to the stage, but maybe I can help others find the light in it, like Oliver did. Charles nodded, understanding she was speaking of herself as much as Oliver. You don't have to decide now, he said. But if you leave, Oliver will be heartbroken. Emma smiled, the first time that day. He's stronger than you think, Mr. Laurent. And so are you. Charles didn't reply, but her words gave him pause. He had spent his life controlling, protecting, but perhaps what Oliver needed most wasn't protection, it was the freedom to grow, to fail, and to rise again. That afternoon, Charles called Oliver to his office. The boy entered, his eyes curious but unafraid. Charles gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, son. Oliver sat, hands clasped, waiting. Charles took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I spoke with Emma. She might leave to pursue a new opportunity. What do you think about that? Oliver bit his lip, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, but he quickly steadied himself. I'll miss her, he said. But she taught me so much, not just about dancing. She said the most important thing is to believe in myself. If she wants to go, I think I'll be okay. Charles looked at his son, astonished by the maturity in his voice. Are you sure? Oliver nodded, a small smile forming. I want to keep dancing, father. Whether Emma's here or not, I want to try again at the next tournament. And this time I want to win. Charles smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Then we'll do it. Together. That evening, Emma stood at the estate's front door, a small suitcase beside her. Charles and Oliver faced her, the air heavy but not sorrowful. Emma looked at Oliver, her eyes gentle. You'll do great, Oliver. Just remember, dance for yourself, not for anyone else. Oliver rushed forward, hugging her tightly. Thank you, Emma, he whispered. I won't forget. Emma smiled, ruffling his hair, then turned to Charles. Thank you for giving me this chance, she said. Not just to teach Oliver, but to rediscover a part of myself. Charles nodded, his voice low. You've changed us, Emma. I won't forget that. Emma stepped out of the estate, her silhouette fading into the sunset. Charles and Oliver watched in silence. As the door closed, Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Ready for the next tournament? Oliver looked up, his eyes blazing with determination. Ready, father. As they walked back into the house, Charles realized that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to control everything. Emma had left them a gift, not just for Oliver, but for him too, the belief that sometimes letting go is the best way to move forward.